Ever get this, like, kind of creepy feeling that there's this, I don't know, a whole other you hiding just below the surface?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Today, we're taking a deep dive, no pun intended, into the shadow self.
Right. And this isn't some, spooky Halloween thing.
Definitely not.
This is actually about, well, it can be kind of tough to
That's
face.
for sure.
But it's about those parts of us we usually like to pretend aren't there,
Yeah.
and how getting to know those shadow sides can actually.
Help us grow.
Exactly. That's exactly it. This is serious personal growth territory.
Okay, so less about ghosts and goblins, more about what makes us tick.
Yeah, and to understand that, we got to look at what Jungian psychology has to say.
Okay, so Jung, not exactly light reading, but super important in this field, right?
He was the one who really dove into the shadow self.
So what are we really talking about? When we say shadow self, what does that even mean?
And so imagine your personality is like a house, right?
Okay, I like this. I'm picturing it.
You've got the rooms you keep all nice and neat for company,
Yeah, make a good impression, put your best foot forward and all that.
but then there's the basement.
Uh-oh. The basement, full of boxes and maybe a few spiders.
Exactly. All that stuff you just shove down there and try to forget about. That's kind of like your shadow self.
The stuff we don't want to deal with.
Yeah, maybe it's like fear of failure or some hidden desire, or those thoughts you're like, whoa, where did that come from?
The stuff that doesn't fit with who we think we are.
Jung was big on this idea that it's not about good versus evil.
Which is what a lot of people think when they hear shadow, right?
Right. It's more about the parts of ourselves we repress because they don't fit that perfect picture we have in our heads.
So it's less about being a bad person, more about just being human.
Exactly. We've all got those boxes in the basement.
But here's the thing. If we just keep shoving stuff down there, isn't that going to create, like, a monster under the bed kind of situation?
That's a great way to put it. It might seem like that stuff is just tucked away, but
It's still taking up space.
yeah. And it can actually mess with how we live our lives.
Okay, you're going to have to give me an example here.
Think about it like this.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever instantly disliked someone? Like right off the bat, you get a bad vibe, think they're arrogant or just annoying.
Oh, all the time.
But then later, you realize maybe it was something in you that you were projecting onto them.
Oh, man. Okay, so you're saying, like, if I'm constantly judging someone for being, I don't know, too controlling.
Maybe deep down, you struggle with wanting control yourself.
So instead of facing that part of myself, I just see it in everyone else.
Bingo. And this source we're looking at, they actually talk about these moments where a usually calm person just erupts, like road rage or snapping at a loved one.
Yikes. Been there.
That's that repressed stuff bubbling up from the shadow.
Instead of dealing with it head on.
Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. In
It makes it
fact,
stronger.
it can actually give it more power over us in the long run.
Okay, so now I'm starting to see why this matters. Because if we try to pretend those shadow parts don't exist.
They can actually end up running the show.
So what happens if we just keep stuffing things down into that metaphorical basement?
Well, Jung believed that's actually what leads to a lot of inner turmoil. Anxiety, self-sabotage, even problems in our relationships because we're not dealing with the root of our behavior.
So it's not about, like, striving for this perfect, shiny version of ourselves.
Not at all.
It's about understanding and accepting all of it, even the messy stuff.
Exactly. Jung said that true personal growth, like the really deep, meaningful kind, it hinges on integrating your shadow, bringing those hidden parts to light.
Which honestly sounds kind of terrifying, if we're being honest.
It can be, but that's what we're going to talk about next. How do we actually do that? And, it's funny you use the word terrifying there.
Yeah, well, facing the stuff we've been avoiding.
It's understandable. But the thing is, this work, it's not about becoming like some perfect Instagrammable version of ourselves.
Thank goodness, because I don't even own a ring light.
It's more like recognizing that we have all these different parts, right? And it's about trying to weave them together into something more,
A more whole picture.
yeah, a whole and authentic you. And the interesting thing is, this source we're looking at, it actually gives us some pretty practical tips to get started.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, one of the most accessible ways is actually through journaling.
Okay, so not just like, Dear Diary, today I had a salad for lunch.
No, not quite, unless maybe that salad really sparked some deep existential crisis.
Maybe it was kale.
Could be. But seriously, it's about paying attention to those times when you feel triggered.
Triggered how?
Like when you get really angry or judgmental or even just insecure. Jot down what happened, and then try to go a little deeper.
So, like, what was it about that situation that really set me off?
Exactly. Was it something someone said? Did it remind you of something? Why do you think it hit such a nerve?
It's almost like playing detective with your own mind.
I like that.
Speaking of uncovering hidden things, I've always been curious about dream analysis. Does that tie into the shadow self at all?
Big time. Jung believed that dreams were a direct line to our unconscious.
Which is where all that shadow stuff lives, right?
Exactly. It's like your subconscious is sending you postcards from that metaphorical basement we were talking about.
Okay, but dream postcards are written in some pretty weird language. How do we even start to decode them?
We'll start by writing them down as soon as you wake up, as much detail as you can remember, and then just look for patterns or recurring symbols or even just strong emotions.
So I shouldn't worry too much about finding the right interpretation.
Not necessarily. It's more about asking yourself, what could this be trying to tell me?
Interesting. It's more about listening to what your subconscious is trying to communicate.
Yeah.
Now, I know for some people, this whole shadow work thing, it can feel pretty overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. It's deep stuff.
Like, is this something you have to tackle all on your own?
You absolutely do not have to go it alone. This source we're looking at, they actually recommend finding a therapist who specializes in this.
Oh, so there are people who can actually help you with this.
Yeah, there's something called shadow work therapy.
Shadow work therapy. So what is that exactly? Do they like hypnotize you and make you confront your demons?
Not quite. It's more like they give you a safe space.
Which is important when you're dealing with stuff that can be kind of scary, right?
Exactly. So a therapist trained in this, they can help you explore those shadow parts, understand where they come from, and find healthier ways to relate to them.
So it's like having a guide, someone in your corner, helping you navigate all those dark corners of your psyche.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it's important to remember, this isn't about judging ourselves for having a shadow.
Yeah, we all have that basement, right?
We all do. It's just about understanding that those parts, they often hold valuable lessons.
Okay, so maybe the shadow isn't the enemy after all.
Maybe it's just trying to get our attention.
You know, it's funny, before we started this whole deep dive thing,
Yeah.
I kind of saw personal growth as this, like, straight line.
Hmm.
You just, I don't know, level up, learn new skills, become a better version of yourself.
Right, like a video game or something.
Totally.
Hmm.
But this whole shadow self thing, it's like you're saying, hey, there's this whole other dimension to this whole journey, you know?
It's definitely not as simple as we'd like to think, is it?
Not at all. So, okay, we've got these shadow parts. We're trying to integrate them. But you were saying something about them actually holding, like, untapped potential. That feels kind of counterintuitive, right?
It does, because we're so used to thinking of these parts as like the enemy.
Right. Like, oh, that's my anger. I got to stuff that down. Or that's my fear. I got to hide that away.
But what if, and I know this sounds strange, what if those parts were actually trying to help us?
Okay, how could something like fear be helpful?
Well, maybe that fear of failure you're carrying around is actually pointing to a deep desire to create something really meaningful, something you're passionate about.
Huh. Never thought of it that way.
Or, you know how you mentioned getting angry easily? Maybe that's not just like a bad thing. Maybe that's actually rooted in a strong sense of justice, but you haven't figured out how to channel that in a healthy way.
Wow. Okay, so this is blowing my mind a little bit because
Okay.
you're saying that the things we judge ourselves for, the things we try to hide, they might actually be the key to becoming more ourselves.
It's like those shadow parts, they're not the problem.
It's how we relate to them.
Exactly. It's like instead of seeing them as these scary monsters,
We could try to befriend them.
that's a great way to put it. Befriend them, understand where they come from, maybe even direct their energy towards something positive.
So it's less about conquering these shadow parts and more about, I don't know, like making them part of the team.
That's a great image. And I think that's what Jung was getting at with this whole idea of integration. It's not about erasing parts of ourselves. It's about weaving them all together into something more whole and authentic.
So as we're wrapping up here, this deep dive into the shadow self, what's one thing you want to leave our listeners with?
I would say this journey, this whole shadow work thing, it's not a quick fix.
Definitely not a one and done kind of deal.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
There's going to be times when you feel like you're making progress.
And times when you're like, what am I even doing?
Exactly. So be patient with yourself, be kind to yourself, and remember, you don't need all the answers right away. Just keep asking questions, keep exploring. You might be surprised what you find.
I love that. And it makes me think maybe those quote-unquote negative emotions, the ones we always try to shove down, maybe they're not the problem in and of themselves. Maybe it's the pushing them away that really causes the suffering.
There's a lot of wisdom in that, and I think that's where self-compassion comes in. Because it is okay to have those messy parts. We all do. What matters is that we choose to face them, to understand them, and to work towards integrating them into, well, just being human, right?
This has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me.
The pleasure was all mine, really.
Yeah.
This is a topic I'm really passionate about.
I can tell. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. We'll be back next time with another deep dive on the deep dive.